Hey, this is Connor from Biker's Edge. It is full-on blizzard mode outside, so we are here in my lovely 70s inspired basement. One of the questions we get asked the most, whether at the shop, on YouTube, on our social media channels, is where does the Transition Spur fit in with the Ibis Ripley and the Santa Cruz Tallboy? So I spent a week in the desert riding all three of those bikes back to back so I could come up with a really good answer for you. So stick around. Here we go. Oh yeah. So first things first, let's just run through each of these bikes really fast, just so you have a basic understanding. We've done reviews of all of these. I will put cards in where it makes sense, so you can click on those to watch the full review of each of these bikes. Let's start with the Transition Spur. It's new for this year. It's 120 millimeters front and rear travel, 29-inch wheels, has a 66-degree head tube, and it has a really long reach. It's 510 millimeters in a size extra large. So this bike is super long, fairly slack. It's pretty aggressive for a bike that kind of blurs the lines between cross country and trail. Next, let's jump into the Ibis Ripley. This one's been around for a minute. It is an excellent climber. I mean, it's pretty mind-blowingly good. Anyway, 29-inch wheels, 120 millimeters of rear travel, 130 millimeters of front travel. It uses the Fox 34, so a little bit lighter weight, not quite as stiff and burly fork. The Ripley has a 66.5-degree head tube angle, and it has a pretty long reach at 500 millimeters in an extra large. Lastly, let's jump into the Santa Cruz Tallboy. Again, 29-inch wheels, 120 millimeters of rear travel, 130 millimeters up front. The Tallboy uses the RockShox Pike, so a little bit bigger, burlier stanchions, a little bit stiffer fork. The head tube angle is the slackest of the bunch at 65.5 degrees, and the bike is actually the smallest in terms of reach. So size extra large in the low geometry setting, which is what I used for this test, it is 488 millimeters, so significantly shorter than the other two. All right, that wraps up quick background on all three of these bikes, so we're going to jump to the ride impressions right now. All right, I'm back here in St. George, Utah again. Starting to feel like home away from home. This time I am on the Spur. One of the questions we get asked the most is how does this bike climb compared to the Ripley? And you're about to find out. Got a steep punchy bit right here. Has the get up and go of a cross country bike. Maybe not full cross country race bike, but you know, kind of like a cross country marathon bike. So has the get up and go of one of those, but the geometry just lets you ride it almost like you'd ride your big bike. Hence, cross country bike for people who wear knee pads. This bike is light, it climbs well, it's pretty efficient. The seat tube angle is nice and steep, get a lot of power through the pedals. It doesn't wallow. Suspension platform uses flex stays instead of an extra pivot down by the rear axle. That makes it a little bit lighter. I think it gives the suspension a unique feel as well. It does feel quick and snappy. I love that jump. All right, so here comes the techie stuff. It's about to get a little tricky. Oh, stalled out. All right, so just to wrap up, final climbing thoughts. I think it gets an A-. It does everything pretty much perfectly, except for, I think, two things. The back wheel can get hung up and bounce around in technical stuff, and it's pretty long and slack for navigating technical stuff. That said, it still is an excellent climber.
Now it's time to go back downhill on the spur. That's where this bike gets super fun. So, the coolest thing about this bike is it's big bike geometry in this little kind of short travel package. I have noticed though, you can get into a little bit of trouble on this bike. So you can get going pretty quick. And then when you need the big travel to save you, it's not there. It's not really a criticism of the bike as much as it is a compliment. You know, it's that good for being short travel. So the suspension on this, it feels like rather planted. I don't know if you can say that about a 120mm bike. This ground is really chattery right now, but the bike's absorbing a lot of it fairly well. It's not uber plush and wobbly. The suspension is pretty supportive. It allows you to pump and push. And, you know, I think that's what lets you ride a 120mm bike so aggressively is the geometry and the suspension platform. There's about 10 million lines through all of this. Oh, fork. Sorry. Jeez. That sounded terrible. Up to an uphill landing. It's not good for it. Alright, we got some fast stuff here. So on that little drop up there, I bottomed out. We'll see what happens here. That one's got a nicer landing. So no bottom out, no harsh clang there. Pretty impressive for a 120mm kind of XC bike. It's not the most, like, I guess, steering friendly bike. It's more of like a lean, more of like a lean and just arc your way through the corner rather than steer, pick your way through a corner. Man, I'm having a hard time concentrating because the riding here is so fun. Sorry. So the spur on the downhill, I think for the category gets an A-. It does everything very, very well. It's got progressive enough geometry that you can push the pace. It's stable, it's aggressive, it's got progressive enough travel that you can kind of push into it. You can, you know, do some bigger features on this without just totally blowing through everything. It's time to head to the car, grab the next bike, do another lap. Okay, so the big question to answer, which bike is the better climber between this and the Spur? Not going to lie, I'm a pretty big fan of DW Link on Ibis bikes. It just feels really, really good. If you've ridden one, you'll know what I'm talking about. It feels super efficient. It just makes the bike feel light and quick. So I think the Ripley is a smoother climber than the Transition. It smooths out the bumps better. It just kind of helps you keep spinning and not getting hung up or having your pedal stroke interrupted by bumps, which if you're climbing on this kind of stuff is super helpful. It makes the bike a little more efficient and a little faster. The Ripley just has a little bit better climbing position Your weight's just a little more centered up on the bike, if not a little forward leaning. Okay, now we're getting to the techie climb here. Climb went pretty well on the spur. There's one little spot that I struggled with, but it's a hard spot, so I'll probably struggle with it on all the bikes. Ooh, and I made it. And this kind of stuff, the bike just doesn't get hung up really at all. It's so crazy. You're used to the back wheel catching those ledges and kind of bumping you up and over. And this just smooths it out. It doesn't even really feel that bumpy. Final climbing grade on the Ripley, just a solid A. Top of the class. Doesn't really get better than this. I've been thinking this whole climb, what's one bone to pick? And I honestly don't have one. So, and I usually have bones to pick. So, good job, Ibis. This is an excellent climber. All right, heading back downhill on the Ripley now. See how this one compares. If the GoPro's not showing it, this trail is really chattery, really rocky. So it's a good test for small bump compliance and kind of how well a bike can hold its speed. Ripley's doing pretty well. It's plenty capable. It's not as stable or smooth as the Spur, but it's plenty capable. Got through that rocky, chunky section fairly well. The suspension design is really good. I don't feel like it's quite as progressive as the Spur. So I'm going through my travel just a little bit easier here. It's not the smoothest in that stuff, but it's not sketchy either. It's not swirly. So the handling on the Ripley is quicker than the Spur. Probably all comes down to the overall length of the bike, reach, wheelbase. So here, you know, that front end's a little more responsive. Just feels like the handling's quicker, like you could steer it a lot better. Getting into some of the bigger, steeper stuff here. And I never remember my line through any of this because there's about 10,000 options, but made it. Yeah, I'm finding bottom quite a bit more on the Ripley here than I was on the Spur. Even, you know, same amount of travel. Man, this Ripley's really lively, engaging, fun, and playful. I'm gonna see how it handles a little drop here. Just fine. That is pretty fun. Very snappy, responsive. Hello. It's not as stable and big and planted as the Spur. Whew, that section is so fun. Just high speed chunk with a couple of good airs in there. So good. So I think I'd give the Ripley a B+ on descending capability. You know, I think the Spur is a lot more aggressive and you can get away with more
on the downhill on the Spur than this bike, but it's still, oh boy, I tagged a rock there. That didn't feel good. But yeah, this bike is still a decent descender. Like I'm not scared to ride this or to go fast or do anything. It's just not quite as planted. I think this kind of fits in the more general purpose trail descending category. So the Tallboy's suspension kind of sits down in just a little bit deeper. It's pretty active. It's got that similar feel to all the rest of Santa Cruz's bikes with the lower link. But this bike isn't your kind of sprinty, lively, energetic, take the hard, punchy line type of bike. It's a little more kind of sit down, spin, get to the top. So that approach is kind of similar to how an enduro bike or an all-mountain bike would go up a climb. You know, this will get you there faster than that. It's lighter, but it's kind of that same feel. All of Santa Cruz's bikes, and the Tallboy included, are traction factories. They just, it's really, really hard to get that back wheel to break loose. They do such a good job of keeping that back wheel on the ground. This bike jumps super well. We'll get to that later, but okay, we're getting to the techie climb section now. See how this Tallboy does. Here we go. Oh, made it. Just barely. To wrap up the Tallboy on the climbs, I think overall I'll go B+. Except in the technical stuff. Gets an A- there. The suspension is really plush, so it's just not quite as efficient uphill. The seat tube just pulls your weight a little more rearward, which is generally never a good thing for climbing performance on a bike. It just doesn't quite match what the other two can offer, especially that Ripley. Gonna hit the downhill on the Tallboy. Ooh, this is nice. So the Spur has rowdier geometry, but I think the Tallboy has the suspension design really nailed for going fast on the downhill on a short travel bike. This feels super plush. It's got that lower link VPP feel. It just makes the bike hug the ground. There's not much skipping around. It feels very quiet, kind of like pitter-pattery over all these rocks. Yeah, this bike is really good on the downhill. It feels nice and stiff, not getting a lot of frame flex, doesn't feel squirrely, tracks a good straight line, carries speed. Here we go. Oh yeah, this is nice. It is fully open, no brakes or any of that. Bike tracks really well. Feels quite a bit more planted than the Ripley. And I'd probably have to say more than the Spur as well, just because of how that suspension works. So going back to back with the Tallboy and the
Spur. I think the biggest difference here is the suspension design, just giving you a little more ground huggy feel and a little more, not a little, quite a bit more traction. I think that's honestly the biggest difference. Tallboy just is glued. For this is kind of the, I would say, the best descender in the group. Oh, some wind caught me there. That was spooky. It just is so planted and glued to the ground. I think the Spur obviously has some more aggressive geometry. It's longer, which does give it some stability. But I think the suspension design here beats that out. And then the Tallboy, if you like to bunny hop and jump and do stuff like that, it is tough to beat this bike. Woo! The handling on this bike is somewhere between the Ripley and the Spur. It's a little quicker than the Spur, not quite as quick and lively as the Ripley. But out of all three, it is the easiest to get off the ground. You get a lot of, I don't know a better word for it, but boost when you bunny hop. Feels really nice. So overall climbing grade on the Tallboy gets a straight A. Top of the class here out of this group. Now, time to head back, write down some thoughts. We're gonna do a conclusion here and really dive in.
So let's get into the awards here. I think that's probably what you're here to know, is where each one stacks up. All right, so climbing awards here. The Ibis Ripley takes the top award. It doesn't get better, you don't get faster, you don't get a better technical climber or smooth climber than the Ibis Ripley. The Spur gets close. It's almost as efficient, and it's probably a little bit lighter, but it just doesn't have the suspension design to quite match that Ripley. And then you've got the Tallboy. It is the slowest climber of all three, and it just doesn't have the same quick, snappy, lively feel. But we flip that to the descents. Tallboy takes the top award. It is the fastest downhill, the most stable downhill, the most confident and planted downhill, and I think the most fun to ride downhill. Right below that is the Spur. It's got the geometry to let you go fast. It just doesn't quite have that suspension design to match the Tallboy. And then down at the bottom, we've got the Ripley. The Ripley is kind of the most trail bike or the least aggressive descender of all three of these. So let's talk about who each bike is for. If you like to ride fast, flowy, smooth terrain, you like to crush miles, and you just like to go uphill really fast, you get the Ripley. You can't beat it, really. It's super fun and rewarding and engaging to ride. On the other hand, if you like to go downhill fast, and that's your biggest emphasis, is how a bike performs downhill, you get the Tallboy. You can't beat it in the descending category. It is the best descending bike of the group. Then if you kind of want the average of those two extremes, you get the Transition Spur. It climbs well, it descends well. It's not as extreme as Tallboy and Ripley in either one of those categories, but it kind of averages those two bikes out, and you meet in the middle somewhere with a very well-rounded and versatile bike. So thanks for sticking around to this point. If you want to demo any one of these bikes, I do leave a link in the description down below for 20 bucks off of a demo bike. You know, I'm a really nice guy trying to help you out here. Make sure to hit that link if you want to try out one of these bikes and know for yourself how it rides. If you have any questions, be sure to hit us up in the comments, visit our website, send us a little email or something, and we're more than happy to help you out. Again, thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.